Let me begin by saying what I'm talking about here today matters or doesn't matter depending on where you're situated. For most of us here from Paris who reside in urban areas, this is something that enters our consciousness, I think, very cursorily. It's a big standoff that is happening in the country between traditional authorities and civil society in rural areas, trying to bring the rural into our thinking about our democratization process. It matters little to a lot of people because there's a deep bifurcation of South African society and also of the conversation between the urban and the rural. So a lot of what is happening in rural areas hardly ever enters the consciousness of people residing in urban areas. But I think the key thing here is what is happening in rural areas haunts our democratization project. And going forward, in fact, I want to think about that term quite seriously, not in this paper. It's a much more modest project here, about the haunting of the democratization project by what is happening in rural areas in South Africa. The political standoff I talk about is, I think, between traditional authorities, like I said, and a section of civil society that is thinking about what is happening in rural areas. And this standoff is, I think, arisen as a result of the failure in the 23 years since the adoption of the interim constitution to resolve the conundrum of the transition, which is what is the place of traditional authorities, of customary leadership in South Africa. And it has meant then, I think, what I'd say is an incomplete transition. I mean, if on one hand, as Ivor says, we can measure the completeness of a transition by whether an autonomous public service has arisen. If we think of rural areas, I think we can measure partly whether the transition is complete by how or whether we've resolved this conundrum of the place of customary authorities. There's an opportunity now, I think, that has arisen, and this is what Alisa was referring to earlier when she was saying this stuff is live in South Africa today. And it has arisen around a new conversation around land reform in South Africa, which I'll touch on. But I think this is where this modest project I'm trying to do in this paper comes from. I think what we've been doing all along, it sounds like the conversation some of the conversations I've been involved in have stood still for the last decade, maybe even longer, because we seem to have been saying the same things over and over again, which is where I think the standoff between civil society and traditional authorities arises. But I think that is the reason why I think the conversation seems to have been standing still, is that we've been conceptualizing what we're talking about incompletely. And so this is what I want to try and do in this paper, to try and push forward our conceptualization of the institutional arrangements that exist in rural South Africa. We've been thinking of a bifurcation between the urban and the rural. And what I want to get to is a suggestion that actually there are three systems we have in South Africa, and trace the histories of why we've ended up with three systems, and begin to think through how do we begin to move forward, to push forward the project of the democratization of the countryside. So, let me then begin by reading a poem called Harlem by Langston Hughes, an American poet. The poem goes, what happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore, and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load. Or does it explode? So let's start with recent events. On the 28th of February this year, King Goodwill Zwelithini, the Zulu king. So here we're talking about the northeastern part of South Africa, KwaZulu-Natal province, this area here. King Goodwill Zwelithini is supposedly the king of that region, asked for donations of 5 rand each. 5 rand is what? 40 cents, 40 American cents, from Zulus to support his legal fight against any attempt to repeal the legislation that established the Ngonyama Trust, a land-holding institution that was legislated into being in the last days of apartheid in 1994. He made this call in a speech he gave at the official opening of the provincial legislature of the KwaZulu-Natal province on the northeastern part of South Africa. Several things are striking and puzzling about this development. The first thing, I think, is the conspicuous role that the king plays in an official state ceremony like the opening of the legislature every year. He seems to be granted de facto constitutional monarch status, even though no such provision exists in the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa. The second thing is that in making this call for donations to a legal defense fund, he, as regional monarch, is purportedly recognized and supported by many Zulus in the province and elsewhere in the country, is threatening a legal challenge to any attempt to repeal this Ngonyama Trust, of which he is the sole trustee, which has allowed him to hold land that was previously the territory of apartheid era KwaZulu, the homeland, which is a third of that province that falls under this trust. The recommendation to repeal the Ngonyama Trust was made by a panel that had been instituted by Parliament called the High-Level Panel on the assessment of key legislation and the acceleration of fundamental change. It had been constituted to review all the legislation passed since the advent of the democratic era in 1994 and its effects. Essentially, then, what Zwelithini is calling for is holding on to the apartheid, part of the apartheid, or actually the apartheid era homeland, on the pretext that, as the former KwaZulu Chief Minister Mangosuthu Buthelezi and the sponsor of the Ngonyama Trust Act, Mangosuthu Buthelezi, has argued, was an attempt to retain what of their land Zulus could keep in the face of the dispossession by colonial powers going back to the 19th century. The third thing that is striking is that King Zwelithini wants to fight the potential democratization of land holding that has been recommended by the high-level panel. The panel's recommendation reads in part, and I quote, "The panel motivates for the repeal of the Ngonyama Trust Act to bring KwaZulu-Natal in line with national land policy and to secure land tenure for the communities and residents concerned. If repeal is not immediately possible, substantial amendments must be made. They must secure the land rights of the people affected and ensure that the land vests in a person or body with proper democratic accountability." Now, King Zwelithini's statements, along with a series of other demands he's made over the years for a bigger budget from the state to ensure that he lives in sufficient luxury fit for a king, I think is a symbol of what happens when undemocratic elements are centrally retained in a democratic transition. When the dream of democratization in the countryside is deferred. What we have now got in South Africa is an ever more strident clamor for the undemocratic element in the form of hereditary so-called traditional leaders to have a place at the table of state power. At the same time, we now have an ever more sophisticated way of insinuating themselves into the state and the market by traditional authorities through land allocation powers that have carried over from colonial and apartheid regimes, negotiating and signing mining deals on behalf of their supposed communities, usually with very little consultation. What also happens is that we get ad hoc, local level negotiations and accommodations between hereditary institutions and democratic ones that are supposed to make the country uniformly democratic. In the end, we find ourselves on a path of no return for the realization of substantive democracy as a result of a balance of forces that has made it politically and socially unfeasible, I think, to decisively settle the question of the place of chieftaincy in post-apartheid South Africa. Like Cameron, I asked the question, how did South Africa get here? Now let's go back to the transition and the formal establishment of this precarious balance we have. The negotiators at the Convention for a Democratic South Africa from 1991 to 1993 arrived at a precarious compromise when it came to what would be the roles and powers of customary leaders. And these customary leaders, we should remember, had largely been local government in the apartheid-era homelands. As Michael Williams notes, chiefs were adamant that they should continue to exercise authority at the local level as representatives of the people. Williams explains that when the first round of negotiations took place in 1991, traditional leaders were not invited. They were only included in the second round of negotiations in 1993. The Nkatha Freedom Party, the party that had led that region of the country, which was the ruling party of KwaZulu homeland and is responsible for giving us the Mbongiseni Trust Act, refused to take part in the negotiations. It also doggedly refused to participate in the elections until quite late in the day. This is the 1994 first democratic elections. They pursued a policy of brinksmanship and violence that resulted in approximately 20,000 deaths in KwaZulu-Natal and elsewhere in the country, mainly around Johannesburg. As Williams notes, it was not until the ANC, the African National Congress, which is the ruling party currently, and the National Party, which ruled at the end of apartheid, agreed to a constitutional principle that guaranteed the Zulu monarchy would be recognized and protected in the newly formed KwaZulu-Natal province, that the IFP agreed to participate in the elections. At about the same time, the Mbongiseni Trust Act was being rushed through the KwaZulu legislature and was eventually signed into law by the last apartheid president, F.W. de Klerk, 3 days before the first democratic elections in 1994. Chiefs all across the country were then beneficiaries of the IFP, the Nkatha Freedom Party's brinksmanship, and the Congress of Traditional Leaders of South Africa, who had engaged in the negotiations and had secured some of the agreements. And thus, what we ended up with when the first democratic elections arrived was an entrenchment of the chieftaincy, a hereditary, largely patrilineal institution, which was set in place at the very heart of the establishment of the South African democracy. Let's go back even further to think how we had arrived at that moment in the negotiations. Now, prior to those negotiations at CODESA and the transition, African National Congress intellectuals such as Govan Begi in the 1950s and Jabulani Mzala Nxumalo as late as 1988, in fact, had seen chieftaincy as a backward institution that would be abolished once democracy had been achieved, according to Van Kessel and Uman. What changed the position of the sections of the African National Congress was the emergence in 1987 of the Congress of Traditional Leaders of South Africa. Contralesa took the African National Congress by surprise and forced a change in their stance. The position of chiefs in relation to the state and to liberation politics had undergone major changes in the preceding century, as traced by Van Kessel and Uman in One Chief, One Vote, the revival of traditional authorities in post-apartheid South Africa. Representing the concern of a small urban black middle class, the early African National Congress had maintained a connection with the rural aristocracy. It had created an upper house for traditional leaders who joined the organization when it was established in 1912. However, the organization was radicalized by the growth of its working class membership during the acceleration of the industrialization process in South Africa in the 1940s and 1950s, and by the coming into power of the National Party in 1948 and the formal establishment of apartheid. From the 1950s onward, the apartheid government had restructured rural society, making chiefs responsible for the recruitment of labor for the mines, and for recruitment of labor for commercial agriculture and industry, for implementing what they called land betterment schemes, which involved the culling of livestock of black people in rural areas, and land demarcation, as well as trying minor cases such as family disputes and disputes over livestock. Chiefs ultimately became accountable to the state and not to people that they led, leading to despotism and deep unpopularity, as Mamdani has demonstrated. Hereditary chiefs were deposed if they were resistant to state policies, and new chiefs were installed. New chiefdoms were also created in the move to re-tribalize Africans, as the policy of the National Party under apartheid was, and chiefs were imposed on communities that had previously had no institution of chieftaincy. In the 1980s, there emerged a very strong resistance from youths aligned to the United Democratic Front that revolted against the authority of these chiefs. From about 1950, the ANC had turned their focus to mobilization in urban areas, no longer perceiving chiefs as potential allies by 1960. By the time of the youth revolts in the 1980s, for the most part, chiefs in the Bantustans had become functionaries of the state with very little popular legitimacy. In the 1980s, many, in fact, even collaborated with the security forces of the apartheid state in trying to suppress these youth revolts, organizing vigilante groups armed by the South African Defence Force that fought bloody battles against members of civic organizations. The Congress of Traditional Leaders of South Africa emerged out of this maelstrom as an alliance of progressive chiefs who were resisting the creation of a new Bantustan for the Ndebele Nzuza in what was then the Northern Transvaal, which falls under the Limpopo province, the northernmost province in the country today. The organization quickly aligned itself with liberation movements, and the dilemma that then followed for the African National Congress was about what the place of chiefs should be in the anti-apartheid alliance was kind of uneasily resolved when the ANC shifted to focusing on a negotiated settlement in the late 1980s as a military victory seemed less and less likely. And thus, to quote Van Kessel and Oomen, with the promise of delivering a block vote in the rural areas for the ANC, chiefs assumed a new role. They're no longer seen as relics of a feudal past, but strategic allies in the conquest of state power after at the first democratic elections in 1994. And so, what happens after 1994? Borrowing Richard Slar's concept, Williams correctly maintains that South Africa established a mixed polity when accommodating chieftaincy in the interim constitution of 1993. However, there was a significant shift in how customary authorities were going to be accommodated from the initial agreements reached in the negotiations as formalized in the interim constitution and the final form that the post-apartheid state was given as defined in the final constitution of 1996. Williams usefully draws out the change. First, whereas the interim constitution, chiefs were going to be entitled to be members of local government and eligible to be elected to any office in local government. In the final constitution, the discretion to decide the status of traditional leaders in local government rests with the president. Secondly, the interim constitution provided that provincial legislation must establish provincial houses of traditional leaders to deal with matters relating to the chieftaincy or customary law. In the final constitution, this provision was watered down, stating that provincial legislation may create such houses. And finally, in the interim constitution, a council of traditional leaders was to have the authority to review national legislation that affected the chieftaincy. In 1996, this was revised to say national government may establish such a body. Ultimately, though, what we ended up with was that in the final constitution, the powers and roles of these traditional or customary leaders were left hollow. Chapter 12 of the constitution merely recognizes the institution of traditional leadership, as it is called, subject to the constitution and subject to customary law. This then left the chiefs absolutely fuming as the opposition, in their positions voiced by the Congress of Traditional Leaders and by the Inkatha Freedom Party. But they thought things had been bad in the constitution, things were to get even worse by 1998, when the local government white paper was published. The white paper proposed the creation of what are called wall-to-wall municipalities. What this meant was the superimposition of new institutions over apartheid-era tribal and regional authorities that had been established by the 1951 Bantu Authorities Act, and then had been territorialized and realized in the 1970s and 1980s when the homelands were established. And kind of institutional plurality at the local level was firmly established to continue the mixed polity established in 1993. The white paper was quickly followed by the Municipal Structures Act of 1998 that formalized a lot of the proposals of the white paper. Effectively, this is what this meant. It meant the legislative establishment of a governance system that retained apartheid-era structures, now redefined not as tribal authorities, but they were going to be renamed traditional authorities to strip away the offensive elements in the name tribe. And these apartheid-era structures were now defended by the customary leaders who had, under apartheid, in fact, resisted them. And they were defended as a system that was going to be retained going forward perpetually into the democratic era. And on top of these renamed tribal authorities was then superimposed a new structure, or elected through the ballot, as Aninka Claessens and Brendan Boyd and others have shown. It also meant a different governance system for areas that were previously demarcated ethnic homelands under apartheid, compared to urban areas and previously white rural South Africa. That is, it meant the retention of the demarcations of the land demarcations, territorial demarcations of the 1913 Native Land Act, which had formalized the land dispossession of the majority of black South Africans by white settlers. In effect, as I'm going to show later though, something much more happened. That was, South Africa did not stop at formally creating two systems. We created three systems, as will become clearer when I turn to thinking through the presence of the bureaucracy across South Africa. It took until 2004 for the state to define and legislate the place of traditional leaders that had been left hollow by the Constitution and by the Municipal Structures Act, 10 years after the first democratic elections. By 1997 in KwaZulu-Natal, traditional leaders still formed local government, as the Inkatha Freedom Party unbendingly insisted that they do. The African National Congress attempted to loosen the grip on traditional leaders of the Inkatha Freedom Party and their rural support by transferring the responsibility of paying cheap salaries from the provincial to the national government in 1996. The Inkatha Freedom Party challenged this move in court and won. And then, that, according to Joe Beals, Mbongiseni Mkhize, and Shahid Vauda, this meant, and I quote, with the rushing through Parliament of the Traditional Leadership and Governance Framework Act in 2004, ahead of the elections, the state finally validated the role of chiefs in local government. They would be leaders of now these reconstituted traditional councils in the rural areas where they would work alongside elected representatives. This meant, according to Beal, Mkhize, and Vauda, quote, significantly entrenching the authority of traditional leaders. And it meant, in effect, legislation introduced in the 21st century will give perpetual life to a system of indirect rule dating back to the colonial era and ossified under apartheid. And that is because, I argue, these traditional councils were a continuation of apartheid-era tribal authorities. The 2003 Traditional Leadership Act meant the former tribal authorities were never discontinued. They were simply renamed as traditional councils. The Act tried to democratize these new councils by stipulating that 40% of members must be elected by communities within a year of the passing of the legislation, and that 30% of members must be women. However, up to today, in fact, not a single council has been found in research conducted by my former colleagues at the Land and Accountability Research Center have met these requirements, democratization requirements. And now the state is trying to make up for this deficit by trying to pass a new law to give these traditional authorities time to comply. Again, there's a new law before Parliament that has been being resisted by civil society. The standoff I was talking about earlier between civil society and traditional authorities. So while it took until 2003 for legislation attempting to clarify the powers and roles of chiefs to be passed, the key thing to note is that customary leaders did not just sit still and wait for this legislation, as Williams shows. What they did was, at the local level, when they were forced to share authority with new institutions that were supposed to be democratic, they then went into full-on competition with these institutions. The new institutions, of course, were based on a sort of norms, rules, and processes that are different from its own, and the chieftaincy set to work negotiating a way to accommodate itself to these new institutions. The result has been, as Williams put it, norms, rules, and processes associated with each. In other words, what we have observed is the development of vernacular forms of democracy, at the level of participation at least. What the Italian anthropologist Lucia Micheluti calls the vernacularization of democracy. By this, Micheluti means the ways in which values and practices of democracy become embedded in particular cultural and social practices, and in the process, they become entrenched in the consciousness of ordinary people. Williams describes how the post-apartheid post-apartheid South African government has sought to simultaneously accommodate and transform the chieftaincy, as it has attempted to introduce democratic norms, processes, and institutions into the former Bantustan areas. The ruling African National Congress's policy of incrementalism, which saw, as I said earlier, the Traditional Leadership and Governance Framework Act passed almost 10 years into the democratic era, meant that at the local level, there were important informal relationships being formed while this formalization of the chieftaincy was being negotiated. After they had lost the battle to become local government, chiefs had to compete with these new local government institutions, and thus the accommodations they set about establishing transformed both the chieftaincy to some degree and these new representative elected local government institutions in the form of this new elected local government. But what the chiefs attempted in all of this, or the end goal that they attempted this accommodation with, was to control these new institutions. And this resulted in the mutual transformation of both, which has taken place in several ways. Just to name three of them. Local government councillors, elected councillors, have had to accommodate themselves to pre-existing local rules, procedures, and norms. They cannot simply claim that their authority is the result of local elections and begin working directly with local communities. Often they have to work through the chiefs and their deputies, such that they end up appearing to a lot of communities as working with or even working under the chiefs. The second way is that in some places chiefs and elected councillors work together on matters of development, which is the function of local government. This is something seen as the most important function, actually, of local government by a lot of rural communities. But sometimes this becomes a co-optation of councillors by chiefs, some of whom they have their own independent access to political power at regional and national levels, and so they are able often to bypass local councillors. And then at the same time, the transformation of the chieftaincy, which has been most fascinating, is that whereas historically a lot of the position of chiefs and their deputies and their assistants has been hereditary, what we've seen incrementally in some places is that with the introduction of democratic norms and practices in post-apartheid South Africa, internal reforms have begun to happen in some of these chieftaincies, such that they've also begun to adopt processes for electing their deputies in most cases and their assistants. So this mutual transformation has been ongoing. What emerges from the above with some clarity then is that in 1993 in South Africa, we left in place tribal authorities. It became quite opaque, in fact, whether they'd been left in place or not. And in the process, we entrenched this hereditary institution as we transitioned to a democratic dispensation. The resulting accommodations that had to be, this was a result of accommodations having to be made with the regional Inkatha Freedom Party and with Contralesa. As I said, in 1998, formally, when we then superimposed on the local elected government on this institution, in the hope that the chieftaincy would be overridden by this new democratic institution. Frederickson Sebeza, writing in 1999, show how there was complete confusion at the local level as these new institutions began to take root, and chiefs and even elected councillors were completely unclear about what their roles were, where the boundaries of their authority were, and so even people were unclear about which of these authorities they are to approach for what. And I think that even persists to this day. An attempt was subsequently made to quote unquote democratize the chieftaincy in introducing this legislation in 2003 that prescribed 30% women and 40% elected members of traditional councils. But by 2018, the formal transition has not been completed because any of those elections that were supposed to happen formally have not taken place, but other kinds of elections have begun to happen, like I showed earlier. And so this has yielded hybrid vernacular practices, norms and rules at the local level, with the two institutions coexisting uneasily, and in many places constantly in tension with one another. While we might celebrate the vernacularization of institutions, I want to caution us against too easily thinking this has been a good thing, because what we've also seen is that there's been a trend of chiefs using their hereditary positions to negotiate with mining and agricultural capital on behalf of communities, becoming business partners in huge mining and farming initiatives, ostensibly on behalf of their communities, and then pocketing huge sums of money that are supposed to be the share of these communities. What was thus established in South Africa, where we thought were two systems, one for urban areas and one for the former homelands. But I think then moving away from the formal establishment through the constitution and through legislation of institutions, I want to now very briefly turn to my attention to examine the presence of the state at the local level, and to arrive at a slightly different conclusion and conceptualization of what we have at present. And this is where I think I want to take up Carlos's invitation to make big mistakes, because this is a part that was written after a conversation we had at Paris the day before we came here. And so I thought about and wrote this on the flight to here. In this section, I want to suggest that when we factor in the presence of the state in rural South Africa, what emerges analytically is that we actually have three rather than two systems. And here I want to cast my mind back to time I've spent in rural South Africa. What becomes discernible to me is that the state is present at the local level in rural South Africa, in the former homelands, like I've shown in that map, as the councillor, the school, the clinic, the social grant payment point, and occasionally the police, the power utility, ESCOM, and maybe the water affairs department. It is not the kind of thick presence of the state that we're accustomed to in urban areas, such as police patrols, such as garbage collection, and such as the various state offices, ranging from those of the local municipality right through to those of provincial departments and the national state. And so the chief and his assistants remain largely responsible for functions such as peacekeeping, the approval or licensing of some activities, and the issuing of some official documents. What the chief does, usually, in most places it is he, performs the functions that require that they require the exercise of executive, judicial, and administrative power. This is different to what happens on commercial farmland, previously what was white rural South Africa, for instance, where the state also has a similarly light presence. But it's the same institutions of the state that are present as in urban areas without being superimposed onto an institution similar to the chieftaincy. Hence, while Aninka Claessens and others have long argued that we have two parallel systems of governance in South Africa, a democratic one for urban residents and a parallel one that is largely undemocratic for rural areas. What factoring in the presence of state institutions begins to suggest is that we actually have three, one in urban areas and two in rural South Africa. For someone who lives in a former homeland, they have a little bit of state bureaucracy, a little bit of elected councillors to deal with, and a lot of chief to muddle through on a daily basis. For someone in an urban township, there's a lot of state present and some councillor. And for someone in former white rural South Africa, they face the light presence of the state bureaucracy and an equally light presence of elected councillors. The farmer for them is probably the governing power they most have to deal with. And so to some preliminary conclusions. To return to the poem I opened with, what then has happened to the dream of democratization in rural South Africa in the last 25 years? I would suggest it has not dried up. In some places, it has been festering like a sore and beginning to run as chiefs, councillors, bureaucrats, and community members fight over how service delivery and land allocation should be conducted. In other places, it is sagging like a heavy load, as impasses over respective roles find no resolution. And yet in others, people muddle on, finding contingent local solutions, and the dream, I think, is crusting and sugaring over like a syrupy sweet. This is, I think, happening because what we did in South Africa was to extend the remit of the state only lightly into the former Bantustans. Symbolically, we unified South Africa into one country. Structurally, we have not yet succeeded in making it the same country. To do so, I think, would require a renegotiation of the place of chieftaincy that continues to haunt the present and to haunt, I think, elected local government. But I think that prior to that, the question that we need to the renegotiation of chieftaincy is to ask the question, what do we mean when we invoke democratization in regard to rural areas? Are we saying we want the countryside to be the same as a city, the same as farmland? We're putting in place similar institutional arrangements when it comes to governance and to the bureaucracy yield equality when it comes to these institutional arrangements? It's a complicated answer. I think we have an opportunity, I think, to experiment with democratization in the current conjuncture. And I think here the current debate around land redistribution offers us a way to rethink what happens. Now, if we think about land redistribution and how it's proceeded, a lot of land, the South African land reform program has three components. One of them is the return of land to people whose land was alienated under colonialism and apartheid. The second component is redistribution of land. Now, and then the third component is tenure reform. But we've focused a lot on the return of land. What we haven't done is think through the redistribution of land. And I think this is where we have an opportunity to think differently. If we think about the redistribution of land, I mean, the map, this is just what I want to conclude with. The spots you see in the map on the left is what black rural South Africa looked like at the end of apartheid. These were the former homelands. To the right of that's the map. This is South Africa about 4 years ago. I was involved in the development of this map. And this is what black rural South Africa still looks like. So we have not changed the map of black rural South Africa. What we've done is, in those places where land has been returned to people, a lot of that land has been put under these new structures that were created by legislation called communal property associations that have also gone into a lot of conflict. I mean, it was meant to be a way for people to collectively hold the land. They've gone into a lot of conflict with chiefs as well. And so the state has been moving towards putting that land under chiefs. The previous Minister of Rural Development and Land Reform said actually they don't support the establishment of any further communal property associations in litigation I was involved in, and they want the land to go under chiefs. What I'm suggesting then is, if we think about redistribution in the current debate in South Africa, which I can talk more about later, I think, apart from the urban areas which are not shown in the map, all other parts of rural South Africa were previously under apartheid, white rural South Africa. And I think the redistribution needs to begin to give land outside of these former Bantustans back to black people. But I think the key thing is, when that land is redistributed, the question is what structures are we going to extend to these areas? Are we going to extend elected local government and extend the remit of the state to these areas? Or are we also going to extend simultaneous to traditional authorities? And I think the experiment we need to try is to not extend the remit of traditional authorities, and let's experiment with a new way in which this land is going to be governed. So I think we are in a crucial moment in South Africa where the debate on land needs to not just stop at talking about land, it also needs to extend to this question, return to the question of the democratization of rural South Africa. Thank you. I'll stop there.